Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to one of the less restful centuries in human history. So, if you're already tucked in, lights low, maybe a cup of something warm by the bed, let's slide quietly into the dim, uneven world of the 14th century. The streets are narrow, the air smells, well, let's say not great, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls for someone who probably didn't make it through the week. Yes, we're talking about the time of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, the disease that swept across Europe like it had a very full appointment book. Now, don't worry, this won't be frightening. We're not here to reenact coughing fits or heap on horror. This is bedtime history, after all. Instead, we'll drift through the quieter, stranger, and often very human ways ordinary people survived, or at least tried to survive, when medicine was basically a mix of robes, masks, and guesswork. Because, as it turns out, plague doctors were not the miracle workers you might imagine. The long-beaked masks, the wide-brimmed hats, yes, they looked impressive. They also made people look like half-hearted bird impersonators at a Renaissance fair. But when it came to actual healing power, let's just say the average village grandmother with her herb garden usually had a better track record. So tonight we'll float slowly through those hidden corners of the plague years, the folk remedies, the rituals, and the everyday survival tricks that made more sense than the doctor's theories about bad air and angry planets. Because sometimes the peasants really did know better. Let's settle first into the atmosphere of the time. The plague arrived in Europe around 1347, carried, we think, by merchant ships. These ships brought silks, spices, and the occasional rat doing a bit of stowaway tourism. Rats, of course, had fleas, and the fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Now, no one at the time knew this. Instead, people thought the heavens were to blame. A strange alignment of planets, perhaps, or maybe it was God punishing people for something. The list was long: eating too much garlic, not attending mass, attending too much mass, breathing in suspiciously smelly air. Medical theory leaned heavily on miasma, bad air, which, to be fair, was not entirely wrong. If you lived in a medieval city where people threw chamber pots into the street, yes, the air was indeed bad. But it wasn't the real culprit. And so the plague doctors came, waddling down the lanes in their long leather coats, carrying sticks to poke patients from a respectful distance. People were supposed to trust them. But here's the twist. The peasants didn't always. They had their own ways, quiet, homegrown methods that often worked out better. One of the simplest survival strategies was quarantine, not invented by governments, but by ordinary villagers. If someone in town got sick, families would quietly disappear into the countryside. They'd hole up in barns, abandoned huts, or just sleep rough in the fields. Better the cold and damp than the coughing neighbor across the lane. In many cases, these little acts of self-preservation kept families alive. Entire villages sometimes barricaded themselves in, posting lookouts at the roads. If a stranger wandered in, they might be greeted with a pitchfork, politely but firmly pointed at their chest. After all, strangers brought news, and often, fleas. It's worth noting that official plague doctors often encouraged large gatherings, public prayers, processions, acts of communal repentance, which, naturally, meant cramming hundreds of frightened people together in a tight square. Nothing says disease control like a super-spreader event led by the local bishop. The villagers, meanwhile, often quietly opted out. They kept their heads down. They stayed put. In this way, the so-called uneducated masses often outsmarted their supposed betters. Another common tactic was herbs. Now, medieval people loved a good herb. They didn't know about bacteria, but they did notice that some plants seemed to help. Garlic, for example, onion, juniper, rosemary, hung over the doorway, was thought to purify the air. In many cases, these had mild antibacterial or insect-repelling qualities. Not enough to cure the plague, but sometimes enough to keep fleas away. Compare this to the plague doctors, who stuffed their bird masks with dried flowers. ambergris, or a sponge soaked in vinegar. It probably made the smell of death less noticeable, which is good for morale, but less helpful in preventing infection. Villagers who burned pungent herbs in their homes were, inadvertently, doing something closer to effective fumigation. And then there were poultices. People would mash up herbs, mix them with animal fat, and smear them on buboes. The swollen lumps that came with the plague. Was it a cure? No, but sometimes it soothed pain. Sometimes it drew out infection, and occasionally it even worked better than the doctor's advice, which might involve bleeding the patient until they resembled a half-empty wineskin. Superstition also played its role. Villagers carried charms, wore amulets, and muttered little protective prayers. While modern science would say these did nothing, psychologically, they mattered. Belief itself gave comfort, and stress relief has always helped the body's chances, at least a little. And then there were the stranger rituals. Some people tried sitting between two roaring fires, in the belief that the smoke would cleanse them. Others bathed in vinegar. Still others drank mixtures involving crushed emeralds or ground-up toads. Did it work? No. Did it keep people busy instead of panicking? Yes, and in times of plague, sometimes calm was the best medicine available. But perhaps the greatest advantage peasants had was mobility. Nobles and city elites were tied to their estates, their courts, their grand homes with all their servants. They couldn't just vanish into the woods. But peasants, they could. A family could pack up their goat, their few belongings, and disappear into the hills. The wealthy often thought themselves untouchable, ensconced in castles and manors. And yet, time and again, those stone walls proved more like traps. Meanwhile, the countryside, for all its hunger and hardship, offered space, fresh air, fewer rats. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. And so we drift, slowly, through this world where common folk found quiet ways to live, while plague doctors clomped about in their bird masks, admired mostly for their fashion sense. Tonight's lesson is soft but clear. Sometimes, the so-called ignorant had a better grasp of reality than the educated. Sometimes, the best medicine was not a beaked mask, but simply staying away. The funny thing about the plague years is that everyone, from kings in their castles to shepherds in the fields, was equally baffled. Illness made no sense. A man could appear perfectly healthy in the morning and be dead by evening, which, naturally, made people a little suspicious of the official healers. Plague doctors promised expertise. They showed up in their long coats, smelling faintly of vinegar and cloves, armed with medical theories that boiled down to, "You've probably sinned, and also your blood is bad." Ordinary people looked at this, nodded politely, and then quietly returned to their own methods. Let's drift over to one of those methods now. Not cures, exactly, but diets believed to ward off sickness. Some villagers swore by eating raw onions every morning. Others leaned heavily on garlic. The smell alone was enough to keep neighbors at a distance, which may have been the real benefit. People noticed, over time, that families who ate strong-smelling herbs sometimes got sick less often. They didn't know it, but fleas didn't enjoy those pungent oils either. And so, by accident, the kitchen garden doubled as a pharmacy. Compare this to the noble households. Aristocrats often relied on exotic spices, nutmeg, saffron, cinnamon brought in from far-off lands at great expense. They believed these rare flavors had healing powers. Unfortunately, saffron did very little against Yersinia pestis. It did, however, make the wealthy very poor, because saffron cost more than gold at the time. Another curious advantage of the peasants was their sheer lack of options. If a village lost its bread oven to illness, families reverted to the old ways: flatbreads on stones, or porridges boiled in pots over smoky fires. These simple, humble meals weren't glamorous, but they reduced trips to crowded markets, and every trip avoided was one less chance to bring home fleas. Meanwhile, elites clung to banquets, to court feasts, to endless servants preparing elaborate dishes. Kitchens swarmed with people, food, animals, and yes, rats. The noble ideal of abundance ironically turned into a breeding ground for disease. It's also worth noting that ordinary people were experts in recognizing patterns. They didn't have books or universities, but they did have generations of memory. Villagers remembered bad harvests, strange illnesses, and odd remedies that sometimes helped. These passed down as little snippets of folk wisdom. For example, don't linger near still water, it makes you sick. Or, if someone develops black swellings under the arms, don't share a bedroll with them. Plague doctors, with all their education, often ignored these common-sense observations. They clung to theories of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. If you were ill, it was because one of these was out of balance. The cure, bleeding of course, or leeches. Or, if you were unlucky, purges, none of which stopped a bacterial infection, but they did leave patients lightheaded enough not to complain. Ordinary people, meanwhile, quietly shut their doors and kept to themselves. In a strange way, social distancing was a peasant invention. They simply called it minding your own business. Let's drift now into the sounds of the medieval village during plague years. Silence, a stillness, broken only by the clatter of a cart or the caw of crows. People learned to keep their footsteps soft, their voices low. The fewer people who knew you were still alive, the less likely anyone would come knocking. Families sometimes painted small marks on their doors, symbols known only to them, to signal who was safe and who was in. Tea. Red herbs tied above a doorway might mean the household was under quarantine. A bunch of lavender might mean the family was healthy, but cautious. It wasn't official policy, but local codes that helped communities survive. The doctors, of course, kept meticulous records too. Lists of patients, lists of deaths, lists of symptoms that read more like grim poetry than medical guidance. But their data rarely translated into survival. The peasants' improvised signals often did. And then there were the animals. Cats, in particular, had an interesting role. The church frowned on them, sometimes even accused them of being linked to witches. But villagers kept them anyway, because cats hunted rats. In some towns where cats were spared, plague rates were mysteriously lower. Not that anyone wrote this down officially, it was too ordinary to be taken seriously. But the families with a few scruffy mousers prowling the barn often lived to tell the tale. Dogs, too, had their place. They served as early warning systems. Restless barking often alerted households to approaching strangers, which meant more time to shut the gate or quietly pretend nobody was home. Meanwhile, the rituals of elites were much more elaborate and often much less effective. Royal courts turned to astrologers, demanding horoscopes that could explain why the heavens had unleashed such a scourge. Was it because Saturn had sidled up to Jupiter? Was it because Mars was in a bad mood? Naturally, the astrologers confirmed these suspicions, drawing careful diagrams of celestial bodies that looked very convincing but did nothing for the rats in the pantry. The peasants simply lit more fires, waved more smoke into the rafters, and hoped the fleas would leave, which, on a small scale, sometimes worked better than blaming Saturn. Another survival trick was running. Simple as that. When the plague came to town, people left. Not everyone could, of course, but those who did sometimes escaped the worst of it. This is why plague seemed to come in waves. It would devastate a town, then vanish, only to reappear months later when some unlucky traveler brought it back. But notice something here. The people most able to flee were not the wealthy, tied to estates, courts, and responsibilities. It was the small families, the wandering workers, the shepherds. Ironically, those with the least to lose often had the greatest chance to survive. And yet, despite all this, survival was never certain. The plague killed millions, reshaping Europe entirely. But it's striking that so many of the little survival strategies, herbs, isolation, cats, garlic, came not from doctors in their bird masks, but from everyday life. The story of the Black Death is usually told in terms of death tolls and doom, but in between those numbers were thousands of tiny, ordinary decisions: close the shutters, burn rosemary, keep a cat, sleep in the fields instead of the town. Each choice, small as it was, made the difference between one more name on a death roll and one more family alive to carry on. And so, as we rest here in the quiet shadows of the 14th century, the lesson drifts softly toward us. Survival wasn't always about the learned or the powerful. Sometimes it was about the grandmother with her herbs, the shepherd who left town just in time, or the farmer who trusted his cat more than the man in the bird mask. Because sometimes the smartest medicine of all was simply common sense. Life in plague times, of course, was not only about sickness. Ordinary people still had to live. They had to feed animals, tend fields, fetch water, and somehow keep children from wandering off into trouble. And so, alongside death, life carried on in small, stubborn ways. Imagine a peasant woman, early morning, scattering grain for her chickens. She has tied sprigs of herbs around her wrist knot, because she believes they'll stop the plague directly, but because the smell is comforting, and comfort is something worth keeping. Her neighbor coughs behind closed shutters, and she knows the risk, but she also knows she must gather firewood before the day gets too hot. Survival wasn't only about avoiding plague, it was about keeping warm, eating something, drinking clean water. The basics mattered just as much as the rituals. Meanwhile, plague doctors arrived in villages with their masks, their staffs, and their air of authority. They carried little notebooks, carefully writing down symptoms. They looked official, but when asked for a cure, their advice often amounted to vague gestures: eat less, pray more, don't breathe so much bad air. To the villagers, this wasn't especially useful, so they nodded politely, and then went back to rubbing garlic on doorframes or stuffing sage into the cracks of windows. One of the most curious folk methods was fumigation. People noticed that smoke seemed to keep away both fleas and bad smells, so they filled homes with burning herbs. Rosemary was common, as was juniper. Sometimes entire bundles of hay were set alight in alleyways, choking streets with smoke. Was it healthy? Likely not. But compared to sharing space with infected neighbors, it might have tipped the odds. Villagers also burned vinegar-soaked cloths, waved them through the air, and even placed bowls of strong-smelling onion water under their beds. Did this cure plague? No. Did it make their homes smell like a salad gone wrong? Absolutely. But it also masked the odors that doctors claimed spread disease, and that simple act gave families a sense of control. Another thing peasants knew well: the value of distance, not only from strangers, but even from loved ones. Families who noticed illness in a household sometimes split up. A father might take the older children to sleep in the barn, while the mother stayed with the sick infant in the cottage. Painful, yes, but sometimes it kept at least part of the family alive. Compare this to noble households, where dozens of servants crowded into enclosed halls. Everyone shared the same air, the same meals, the same bedchambers. If one fell ill, all were at risk. But aristocrats often saw separating themselves from their retainers as beneath them. Peasants, with less pride to uphold, quietly accepted that sometimes love meant distance. Let's drift for a moment into the world of superstition. Villagers believed that ringing church bells might drive away plague. After all, bells were loud, and loud things scared away storms. Why not disease? But when bells failed, people turned to charms. A scrap of parchment with a saint's name, a bit of bone worn as a pendant, or, for the very poor, a simple stone carried in the pocket, not because they believed the stone had magical power, but because having something to hold on to was better than nothing. Doctors scoffed at these charms, preferring their own scientific methods. One popular cure was to apply a live chicken to the buboes. Yes, you heard that correctly. The doctor would pluck the feathers from a chicken's rear end, press it against the swollen lymph nodes, and wait for the bird to somehow absorb the illness. Unsurprisingly, this rarely worked, and yet it was considered a serious medical practice. Meanwhile, Villagers who simply covered their sores with herbs at least avoided the indignity of being used as a chicken perch. Animals, as I mentioned before, played a subtle but important role. Cats reduced rats, dogs kept watch. Even pigs and goats had a function. Their waste could be burned, producing acrid smoke that, while unpleasant, kept certain pests at bay. Nothing went unused. Nothing was wasted. In an age when medicine had little to offer, improvisation was its own form of wisdom. And yet, perhaps the most important survival trick of all was patience. Peasants learned to wait out the waves of plague, to wait for the bells to stop tolling, to wait for the air to feel safe again. Whole villages went quiet for weeks at a time, speaking little, traveling less. This enforced stillness was not easy, but it worked. In many places, those who moved least often lived longest. Ironically, elites did the opposite. Nobles fled from city to city, dragging retinues behind them, hoping to outrun the disease. In doing so, they often carried it with them. A single household could turn a safe town into a new center of infection, simply by arriving with all their servants. And so the plague spread, helped along not by peasants, but by the very people who considered themselves above the common herd. Let's drift now into the quieter details of daily life. A child playing with a carved wooden toy, while her parents hang garlic from the rafters. A shepherd leading his flock farther into the hills, hoping to escape both wolves and sickness. A baker wiping down his oven with vinegar before baking loaves, because he heard it might keep the bread pure. Small rituals, small hopes, each one a way of saying, we want to live. And in many cases, these tiny efforts, fumigation, garlic, distance, saved more lives than the solemn advice of doctors in their masks. So, what do we learn from this drifting journey through plague years? That sometimes wisdom comes not from the top down, but from the ground up. That ordinary people, with no training and no authority, often understood more about survival than those who claimed expertise. And that the best defenses were not always elaborate cures, but simple acts of caution, observation, and stubborn endurance. In the end, the peasants who burned rosemary, who kept their cats, who slipped quietly into the woods, they were the ones who shaped survival. The plague doctors may have written the records, but it was the ordinary, nameless families who carried the memory forward. And so, as we let our eyes grow heavy tonight, we can settle into this gentle irony, that in the darkest years of the Middle Ages, survival came not from masks and staffs, but from common sense, from grandmothers, and gardens, and goats, from garlic on door frames, and children kept indoors, from silence, patience, and a refusal to gather in crowds, just because someone said it would help. Because sometimes, in history as in life, the simplest choices are the ones that save us. The thing about living through plague years was that, after a while, people became almost used to it. Not comfortable. Of course, no one was comfortable but accustomed. Bells rang often enough that they became part of the background noise. Wooden carts creaked down the streets, carrying bodies away, and children sometimes followed them out of curiosity, the way one might trail behind a traveling minstrel. Humans, after all, can adapt to almost anything, even despair. And so, alongside illness, people kept on with ordinary chores, washing clothes in streams, repairing roofs, brewing ale that was sometimes more water than grain. Even small festivals took place in the safer gaps between waves of disease, because if people stopped gathering entirely, they feared the world would unravel. In these moments, the plague doctors would drift back into villages, taking notes, poking patients gently with their sticks, and offering long explanations about the movements of the planets. Villagers listened, as politely as one could, when sitting next to a man dressed like a nightmare bird. Then, once the doctor had left, they returned to their own methods, hanging charms, burning herbs, or simply staying out of sight. One survival trick, often overlooked, was the use of water. Doctors warned against bathing, believing it opened the pores to bad air. But peasants, especially those living near rivers, sometimes washed more often, simply to feel clean. Soap was rare, but even a scrub with sand or ash made people feel fresher. And by accident, this occasional washing sometimes reduced fleas. The irony here is gentle but sharp. The people considered ignorant were sometimes cleaner, in their own way, than the professionals who advised them. In the countryside, women often washed bedding in boiling pots, scalding the fabric. Again, they didn't know why it helped. They only noticed that sickness spread less in families who boiled their linens. The doctors, meanwhile, were busy applying leeches to patients and wondering why no one was recovering. Food also played a role in survival. Villagers leaned heavily on porridge grains boiled in water until they formed a thick mush. Not exactly exciting, but filling. Some added herbs, both for flavor and for protection. A pinch of thyme, a handful of sage, maybe wild garlic if it was in season. These meals were simple, repetitive, and usually shared from one pot. The nobility, by contrast, still demanded feasts. Even in times of plague, lords summoned musicians, served roasts, and drank wine in large gatherings. Their belief was that abundance would ward off despair. What it actually did was invite contagion. Crowds, servants, food handlers, entertainers all packed together in one hall. To peasants, this looked less like a celebration and more like an elaborate way to ensure everyone got sick at once. Let us drift for a moment into one of the more unusual folk practices, carrying sweet-smelling objects, a sprig of lavender in the pocket, a dried orange stuffed with cloves, a little pouch of crushed herbs tied around the neck. These were called posies, and while nursery rhymes later turned them into something quaint, at the time they were deadly serious. Villagers believed that holding a posy close to the nose would block out the bad air. Of course, the plague wasn't airborne in the way they thought, but keeping a bundle of herbs near the face did have one side effect. Fleas disliked strong scents. So again, without realizing it, peasants had stumbled onto a mild but useful form of protection. The doctors, meanwhile, filled their beak masks with the same materials, lavender, cloves, sometimes even camphor. But because they leaned so heavily on theory, they didn't apply the idea in smaller, practical ways. They walked around smelling of roses, while peasants simply wore little pouches of rosemary. And often, it was the peasant who walked away healthier. Religion, naturally, played a role. Some villagers held processions, chanting through the streets, begging for mercy. But in other places, people quietly prayed at home instead, deciding that crowds were not the safest idea. Families gathered around small shrines, muttered quiet prayers, and avoided being seen. Ironically, the ones who chose private devotion often fared better than those who joined public displays. Faith expressed in whispers was sometimes more effective than faith shouted in the square. Another curious detail is how people used sound. Villagers rang small bells, banged pots, or sang loudly near their homes to ward off evil spirits. While the spirits did not oblige, the noise may have served another purpose, kept strangers away. After all, if you heard an odd clamor from a cottage, you might decide to visit another day. And in plague times, fewer visitors often meant more survivors. The doctors, on the other hand, relied on silence. They entered homes in solemn stillness, spoke in hushed tones, and left quietly. Their presence was meant to reassure, but more often it spread fear. To see a man in a long coat and beak mask stepping into your house was rarely a good omen. Villagers preferred the noisy clang of pots over the silence of a plague doctor's visit. We can also drift into this strange relationship people had with smells. It wasn't just herbs. Some villagers believed foul odors could fight foul disease. They carried vials of pitch, dung, or tar, inhaling the stench in hopes it would chase away sickness. It didn't, of course, but it made them less pleasant to sit beside, which again reduced contact. By accident, unpleasant smells sometimes worked as social distancing tools. Compare this with the elites, who favored perfumes. They drenched themselves in rosewater, believing it kept disease away. But rosewater attracted insects. So, once more, the wealthy sometimes worsened their own odds. while peasants survived by smelling vaguely like a compost heap. And then there was simple observation. Families noticed patterns. Sickness followed rats. Sickness followed travelers. Sickness followed crowded gatherings. And so, they avoided rats where possible, kept strangers at arm's length, and reduced gatherings. They may not have known why, but they understood enough to change their behavior. Doctors, however, trusted their books more than their eyes. Theories of humors, charts of stars, long Latin words, these guided their treatments. And so, the people who were trained to heal often ignored the very clues that ordinary folk quietly acted upon. And so, as we drift deeper into this quiet history, we see a gentle irony take shape. The plague doctors, remembered in their eerie masks, are symbols of medicine in the Middle Ages, but the real story of survival belongs to peasants with herbs in their gardens, garlic on their doors, and patience in their silence. Because when the world grew dark and uncertain, it wasn't always knowledge that saved people. Sometimes it was simply caution, common sense, and the wisdom of doing less. The rhythm of village life during plague years slowed down to something almost dreamlike. People moved less. They spoke more softly. A baker opened his oven, not every day, but once a week. A smith hammered his iron slowly, pausing often to look around, as if listening for danger. Survival meant less haste, less noise, fewer risks. Children, too, adjusted. They were told to play near the hearth, not in the street, to stay close to the goats, but not to wander near the well if others were about. Parents invented little songs about herbs, garlic for the door, rosemary for the rafters, so children would remember. These were lullabies of survival, sung not with joy, but with quiet hope. Doctors rarely sang. They wrote instead, pages upon pages of theories about the plague, which often boiled down to elegant Latin ways of saying we don't know. Villagers might not have understood the words, but they understood the results. And so, when the doctor's back was turned, the villagers did what they always had. They trusted their own memories, their own patterns, their own common sense. One of the more curious home remedies was vinegar. People washed their hands in it. They rinsed their mouths. Some even bathed lightly in vinegar water, convinced it purified the skin. While it did not kill the plague, vinegar does have mild antibacterial qualities. It certainly killed some germs, though not the most important one. Still, washing with vinegar likely helped a little. At the very least, it encouraged people to wash, which mattered more than they knew. Doctors noticed this too, and so they prescribed elaborate vinegars mixed with herbs, sometimes adding wine for good measure. The noble versions were expensive and required rare ingredients. The peasant versions used whatever was on hand, plain vinegar, with maybe a sprig of sage. Ironically, the simple method worked just as well, if not better. And then, there was the matter of quarantine. Villagers sometimes took drastic measures. A whole community might decide, in whispers, to close its gates. No one in, no one out. Travelers were turned away. Traders found the market empty. These silent quarantines, born not from official law but from mutual agreement, sometimes kept villagers safe. But this safety came at a price. Families inside the quarantine had to rely on one another. Grain had to be shared, water fetched in turns. When one house lost its father, neighbors helped tend the animals. There was no government support, no doctor who could save them, only each other. And this solidarity born of desperation was a kind of survival that the plague doctors never recorded. Let's drift for a moment into the smells of a medieval home. Smoke from a hearth, dried herbs hanging in bundles, garlic rubbed on doorframes, a faint tang of vinegar, maybe even tar, smeared on cracks to keep rats from sneaking in. To us, this might smell unpleasant. To them, it was the smell of safety. The smell of a family trying to live through another season. The doctors, of course, carried their own smells. Their masks reeked of camphor, roses, and dried spice. The leather of their coats gave off an animal musk. Some carried pomanders, metal balls filled with perfumes to sniff as they walked. Villagers sometimes joked quietly that you could smell a plague doctor before you saw him. which, in fairness, gave them a chance to hide before he knocked on the door. We might also consider the role of luck. No matter how careful people were, sometimes survival came down to chance. A flea bit one brother but not another. A family fled to the woods, only to stumble into another infected camp. Even the best remedies could not guarantee life. And yet, in the midst of so much randomness, peasants clung to routines, because routines gave the illusion of control. Burn this herb, wash that sheet, rub garlic on the door. Even if luck decided the outcome, people wanted to believe their actions mattered. Doctors, for all their theories, were no less subject to luck. Some survived their rounds, some did not. Their long coats may have helped, in that they kept fleas off the skin, but just as often they fell ill anyway, which only deepened the villagers' belief that perhaps the doctors weren't so special after all. Let's wander into one of the darker but still oddly human practices: blame. When things grew too desperate, people sought someone to hold responsible. Sometimes this was the wealthy accused of hoarding food or spreading illness. Sometimes it was outsiders, strangers, or those who looked different. Villagers whispered about poisoned wells, about travelers carrying bad air in their cloaks. These fears led to cruel acts, as fear often does. But in quieter places, families resisted the urge. Instead of lashing out, they simply stayed put, trusting no one, blaming no one, waiting for the worst to pass. The doctors, meanwhile, also blamed. They blamed the stars. They blamed mists rising from swamps. They blamed laziness, gluttony, pride. Their lists of causes were long, but curiously, they rarely blamed the one thing that was almost always present: rats. The creatures scurried in plain sight, and yet doctors dismissed them. Villagers, on the other hand, kept cats. They may not have known why, but they noticed that households with cats often did a little better. We might pause here, at the edge of a medieval night. A small cottage, shuttered against the dark. A family sits close to the hearth. They eat a thin porridge, flavored with herbs. A cat curls at their feet. Outside, the village is quiet. A bell rings faintly in the distance, but they pretend not to hear. The mother hums a low song. The father rubs garlic on the lintel one more time. The children press close, comforted by the warmth of routine. This is survival, not grand, not glorious, but steady. And in contrast, somewhere in a nearby town, a doctor adjusts his mask, dips a quill, and writes carefully in his ledger. The patient has expired, cause unknown, prescribed bleeding, outcome unfavorable. His notes will be preserved, his name remembered, but the family in the cottage, the ones who quietly survived, will be forgotten, except, of course, by the generations who came after. So, as we drift together through this part of history, we see the soft irony more clearly. The plague doctors, with their grand costumes and their Latin theories, are the ones we remember. Yet it was the peasants, with their herbs, their cats, their silence, and their stubborn caution, who often outsmarted them. Survival did not always come from wisdom written in books. Sometimes it came from garlic on the rafters, vinegar on the hands, and the simple act of staying away. And that, perhaps, is the gentlest lesson of all. That history is not only shaped by the great and the titled, but also by the nameless, by the quiet, practical, ordinary people who found ways to live when living seemed impossible. If we wander south, into Italy during the plague years, we find that ordinary people used methods that mixed survival with ritual. Windows were opened at dawn, because fresh morning air was thought to sweep away night vapors. Vinegar-soaked cloths were hung from shutters, fluttering like flags of protection. Families carried sprigs of rosemary, not just for health, but for comfort. The scent of green leaves reminded them of life. Up in northern Europe, in colder villages, the customs shifted. Fires were kept burning day and night, not only for warmth, but because people believed smoke drove out disease. Pine branches were burned, damp moss, sometimes even animal dung, though neighbors complained. Yet the belief was strong. If the air was thick with smoke, the sickness might not enter. We can almost imagine a cottage filled with a grey haze, children squinting near the fire, coughing a little, but safer in their parents' minds. The doctor's mask, with its perfumed herbs, was grand, but the villager's smoky hearth was more constant, more trusted. There was also the curious business of charms. Some families wore little pouches around their necks, filled with herbs or scraps of written prayers. A mother might sew a charm into her child's clothes, quietly, without telling anyone. Sometimes it was a piece of iron, an old nail, a bent spoon. Iron was thought to repel evil. Sometimes it was a dried toad, worn for protection. The logic was unclear, but the faith was steady. Doctors might scoff at these charms. They preferred bleeding or purging, which, to the patient, was often worse than doing nothing. Villagers, with their quiet charms and whispered prayers, at least caused no harm, and sometimes simply believing one was protected gave a strength that mattered. Markets during plague years were eerie places. Fewer stalls, fewer voices. A baker sold bread from a distance, sometimes placing loaves on a board so the customer could pick them up without touching his hands. Coins were dropped in vinegar bowls before being accepted. Some towns even banned markets altogether, forcing peasants to barter privately. "I will give you milk if you give me grain." It was awkward, but it worked. Doctors had little role here. They were not welcome in the market. They appeared only at houses of the sick or the wealthy. And so, commerce fragile, stumbling, but alive, was maintained not by medicine, but by improvisation. Let's drift into the daily chores of those years. A woman waking early to fetch water, glancing nervously at the neighbor's house, wondering if anyone inside is still alive. A man feeding chickens, muttering a prayer under his breath. Children helping to gather herbs, not as play but as duty. These little acts were survival. Doctors never saw them, never recorded them, but they mattered far more than a prescription. And the animals, let's not forget them. Cats, of course, prowled after rats. Dogs guarded doors, barking at strangers who might carry disease. Even pigs played a role, eating scraps so they did not fester. Families noticed which animals seemed to stay well. Cats, in particular, earned a reputation as protectors. A cottage with a cat felt safer, even if no one could say why. We might pause here, at the contrast again. A peasant's cottage, small, smoky, lined with garlic braids, with a charm above the door. A doctor's ledger, pages of theories about air and blood and stars. Which of these truly saved more lives? It's not an easy question, but when we look at survival rates, it was often the simplest habits, not the learned theories, that made the difference. Even noble households, with their access to doctors, sometimes fared worse. They submitted to bleedings, purges, and elaborate concoctions that weakened the body. A peasant, too poor to call a doctor, relied on rest, herbs, and the rhythm of life. Ironically, poverty itself sometimes offered protection. And then, there were the quiet quarantines within families. When one person showed signs, sometimes they were gently moved to a shed, a barn, or a small outbuilding. Food was left nearby. Contact was limited. It was heartbreaking, but it was done with love. Doctors would have called it cruel, perhaps. Yet it often slowed the spread within households. In some cases, the sick recovered alone, stumbling back to the cottage weeks later, pale but alive. In others, they passed quietly, and the family could continue. Painful choices, made without ceremony, but with survival in mind. Superstitions were everywhere. A crow flying over the roof was a bad sign. A sudden storm might be blamed on the plague's anger. Yet superstition was not only fear, it was also comfort. It gave people explanations when none existed. Doctors gave complicated reasons involving planets and mists. Peasants gave simpler ones. Both were wrong, but one was at least easier to bear. At night, the villagers fell silent. No music, no feasts, no dances, just the occasional cry of an owl. Families shut their doors, clutched their charms, stirred their smoky fires, and in this silence, the contrast was stark. The doctors, remembered for their costumes, for their bills, for their notes. The peasants, forgotten, yet quietly bending the odds in their favor with every sprig of rosemary, every spoonful of vinegar, every stubborn decision to endure. So we drift further, through smoke-filled cottages, vinegar-washed coins, cats curled on warm hearths, and the steady determination of people with no degrees, no masks, no power, only memory, instinct, and faith. And somehow, in so many places, it was enough. In southern France, people whispered about Saint Roch, who was believed to heal plague victims. Families placed small wooden carvings of him by the hearth, or stitched his name onto cloth charms. In Italy, prayers went up to Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows in paintings because arrows of disease, it was thought, could be deflected by his suffering. A simple candle lit before a saint's image gave comfort, whether or not it gave health. Meanwhile, in villages farther north, saints were invoked less often than local folk spirits. A household might hang a horseshoe above the door, not for luck in our modern sense, but to keep diseased spirits from entering. Children were told to avoid crossroads at night, where restless souls lingered. These were not medical instructions, but they gave families a map of behavior. Stay home, stay safe, keep to your own path. In their own way, these rules worked. Let's drift now into the rhythms of burial. A grim topic, yes, but softened by time. In villages, funerals became small, pared down to essentials. A few family members, a shallow grave near the churchyard. Sometimes, if too many were lost, the rites were shortened. But still, candles were lit. Still, a prayer was said. And still, the survivors marked the passing, however quietly. Doctors, in their ledgers, recorded numbers. The peasants, in their memories, recorded faces. They carried the grief forward, one season into the next, speaking softly of those who had gone. In this way, survival was not only physical, but emotional. Holding on to memory helped people endure. Urban life told a different story. In crowded cities, plague spread quickly. Doctors moved from house to house, busy and often powerless. Remedies were expensive, and the poor could not afford them. Families crowded in tenements had little space for garlic charms or smoky fires. Here, survival was harder, and yet some endured by fleeing to the countryside or by relying on networks of neighbors who pooled resources. Rural life, for all its poverty, sometimes offered better chances. Fewer people, fewer fleas, more space. Doctors rarely came to small hamlets at all, which spared them the hazards of unhelpful treatments. Ironically, the absence of medicine was itself a kind of medicine. Children, even in plague years, found ways to play. They chased each other around smoky hearths. They collected herbs, pretending to be little healers. In some places, simple rhymes emerged about roses, or pockets of herbs, or falling down together. Not as deliberate games of death, but as nervous laughter turned into play. Adults may have frowned, but also smiled faintly, knowing children were finding ways to process what they could not understand. And then, there were the seasonal rituals, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn. Families kept to these patterns, even when death was near. To skip planting meant no food the next year, so they worked the soil, bent their backs, carried water. In doing so, they gave themselves not just survival for the present, but a thread of hope for the future. Doctors did not record the labor of fields, but it was these small, stubborn acts of farming that kept Europe alive through the plague years. We might pause, just for a moment, in a quiet Italian village. A woman places sprigs of sage in her window. A man sharpens a scythe, looking at the hills. Children run barefoot, chasing a cat that does not care to be caught. Somewhere, a doctor in a mask is walking the narrow streets, his leather coat creaking softly. But in the cottages, the families have already made their choices of garlic, smoke, charms, and patience. Choices the doctor will not notice, but which may well save them. And so we return to the irony once more. The plague doctors, with their long beaks and fearful presence, live on in our imagination. They are in the books, in the art, in the costumes of festivals. Yet it was the quiet villagers, unseen and unnamed, who outwitted death in small, stubborn ways, not with theories, but with garlic, not with ledgers, but with memory, not with masks, but with common sense. Survival, as it turns out, was not always learned in universities. Sometimes it was passed along in lullabies, in whispered advice by the hearth, in the way a mother tucked rosemary under a child's pillow. Simple acts, carried forward by generations, which worked just enough to make a difference. Food, in plague years, was more than sustenance. It was seen as medicine. A family who managed to keep bread on the table felt safer, healthier, more alive. Garlic, of course, was eaten raw, sometimes spread on bread or boiled in soups. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were prized for their sharp smells, which people thought drove away sickness. Meat was rarer, and often salted to last through the lean months. For the wealthy, doctors prescribed complicated diets, white bread, fine wines, delicate meats. Avoid pork, they said. Avoid fruit, avoid heavy foods. Yet peasants ate what they had, and sometimes that was better. Coarse bread filled the stomach. Gruel with garlic kept them warm. Turnips, beans, and ale brewed at home gave steady, if plain, nourishment, not glamorous, but reliable. Doctors bled their noble patients to balance humors. Peasants bled their goats to make soup. One method drained life, the other preserved it. Local midwives and wise women also played their part. They were not called doctors. They were often mistrusted by officials. Yet, in the villages, they were the ones people turned to first. A midwife might bring herbs for a fever, or whisper charms over a child's cradle. She knew which plant soothed the stomach, which leaf eased a rash. Her remedies were simple, but they comforted, and comfort was a kind of healing. Sometimes these women faced suspicion. If too many died, whispers of witchcraft circled. Yet when families survived, they quietly thanked the same woman they had doubted. Her work was done in kitchens, in gardens, in smoky rooms where no plague doctor cared to enter. She is rarely remembered in history books, yet she was often more useful than the man in the beaked mask. Cleansing rituals were another quiet habit. Houses were swept often, floors scrubbed with vinegar water, doorframes rubbed with garlic, rafters sprinkled with herbs. Some families burned juniper branches inside the cottage, letting the sharp smoke coat the walls. Others hung salt above the door, believing it trapped evil spirits. A house that smelled sharp and smoky felt safer, whether or not it was. Villagers also tried communal cleansings. A bell was rung. People walked the boundaries, scattering herbs in ditches and crossroads. Sometimes the priest came, sprinkling holy water along fences and barns. Sometimes it was simply the villagers themselves, pacing slowly, muttering prayers. These rituals did not cure the plague, but they gave people a sense of unity, and unity helped them endure. Festivals, once bright with dancing and feasting, grew quieter. A harvest feast might be held, but smaller, subdued. Bread and ale, shared on benches outside, without music. Weddings were postponed, or reduced to whispered vows at a church door. Children still tried to celebrate, but the laughter was softer, cautious. The joy was restrained, as though people were afraid to call attention to it. Yet even in muted form, festivals mattered. They reminded people of normal times. They gave rhythm to the year. Without them, despair would have deepened. And so, in spite of the plague, in spite of fear, people still carved a goose at Michaelmas, still lit candles at Christmas, still blessed fields at spring planting. Not with grandeur, but with persistence. If we listen closely to those years, we hear a rhythm of contrasts. Doctors with their elaborate theories, peasants with their humble habits, ledgers filled with causes, kitchens filled with garlic, prescriptions of bleeding, pots of cabbage soup, long masks filled with roses, small cottages filled with smoke. And through it all, survival was not evenly spread. Many died, of course, too many to count. Yet those who lived did so not by following doctors, but by following their own instincts, their own patterns, their own stubborn sense that life must go on. Let's imagine one more village night. The stars are clear. The air smells of smoke and herbs. A cat prowls along a fence. Inside, a family settles. The children whisper, half asleep. The mother lays sprigs of rosemary near the bed. The father turns the key in the door. Outside, silence. No doctor tonight. No mask, no bills, no ledger. Only the family, their little rituals, their garlic, their smoke, and their hope. And in that quiet determination, they outwitted not only the plague, but also the men who claimed to hold the cure. If we travel eastward, into Poland and parts of Central Europe, the plague years took on their own flavor. Villages here were often smaller and more scattered, which helped. The people had more space, more woods, more streams to keep them apart. Some regions even recorded fewer outbreaks than expected. Later historians wondered why. Was it luck? Was it geography? Or was it, as some villagers quietly claimed, because they kept stricter quarantines? Families here were known to close their doors for weeks, keeping to themselves, trading only within the household. It was not a cheerful way to live, but it worked. A household sealed like a chest could sometimes wait out the worst. Doctors were far away, usually in towns, and so the Polish peasants survived, not by reaching outward, but by drawing inward, tightening the circle of daily life until the danger passed. Farther west, in Spain, people leaned more heavily on religious processions, streets filled with chanting, candles, prayers to saints. Yet even here, some noticed that the processions spread illness rather than stopping it. In smaller towns, ordinary families adapted by making their prayers at home instead. A candle on the table, a whispered saint's name, a quiet hymn sung before bed. Less spectacle, but safer. Doctors, of course, encouraged the public prayers until they noticed the crowds fell sick. Then, naturally, they advised against them. Ordinary people had often noticed first. In the Middle East, where the Black Death also struck, families turned to both faith and practical care. Water was drawn carefully, markets thinned, and travelers were viewed with suspicion. In some places, people washed more frequently, which may have helped. Doctors in these regions wrote long treatises as well, but at the household level, survival came down to the same things it did in Europe: food, family, prayer, and avoidance. Different words, different rituals, but the same quiet resilience. We can also look north, to Scandinavia. There, the plague was feared as much as the cold. Villagers used smoke from juniper branches, filling rooms until the air stung the eyes. They believed sharp, biting smoke cleansed the space. In the long winters, households already spent months together indoors. In plague years, they simply sealed the doors tighter. Some villages recorded traditions of throwing herbs on the fire at midnight, so the smoke would carry health through the rafters while everyone slept. It was a simple idea: breathe the smoke, and you'll be protected. The logic was shaky, but the ritual gave comfort. One thread across all these lands was a certain distrust of strangers. A man at the door might bring news, or he might bring death. Travelers were sometimes chased away. At other times, they were offered bread and water at a distance, with no contact. Hospitality, once sacred, became cautious. This may sound harsh, but it was practical. And practical choices, however unkind, often meant survival. As for doctors, they were not absent everywhere. In larger towns, they came with their masks, their cloaks, their theories, but they rarely visited the poorest homes. Their fees were too high, and their presence too ominous. Villagers often believed that when a doctor entered, it meant someone was already as good as gone. And so, paradoxically, avoiding the doctor became its own form of protection. We might imagine, late one night, a knock at the cottage door. The family looks at each other, silent. They do not answer. The doctor, hearing nothing, moves on. Inside, the family breathes a little easier. The mask passes by, and they return to their garlic and their smoke. In their hearts, they feel safer for having hidden. Let's linger a moment on children's games, because even in plague years, children found ways to turn fear into play. They made up rhymes about herbs, chasing each other with sprigs of rosemary. They pretended to be doctors, one child wearing a stick for a beak, the others running away shrieking. Sometimes they acted out little funerals for dolls or birds, laying them in boxes, saying solemn prayers. Adults might have frowned, but they let it pass. Better for children to laugh softly at death than to weep constantly. The texture of life, then, was uneven. Some families survived through luck, others through garlic and vinegar, others through stricter isolation. Some relied on saints, some on charms, some on smoke, but nearly all of them peasants, townsfolk, farmers, mothers. Children shared one thing: they trusted themselves more than the doctors, and quietly, stubbornly, it often worked. It's strange, isn't it, that the figure we now remember, the man in the bird-like mask, was not the hero of the story. He was more like a passing shadow, tall and unsettling, gliding briefly through history. The real survivors were the forgotten families, the ones who boiled cabbage soup, burned juniper smoke, rubbed garlic on rafters, and kept the cat well fed. Their survival was not grand, not dramatic, not recorded in any Latin text, but it was survival all the same. Let's drift now into the kitchens. Not the grand kitchens of palaces, where roasts turned on spits the size of tree trunks, but the small smoky hearths of peasant cottages. These were the real laboratories of plague survival. Inside, pots bubbled with thin broth. Herbs floated in water. Sage, thyme, a little mint if it could be spared. People had no idea about microbes, but they did know one thing: hot food soothed, and bitter leaves seemed to strengthen the body. Broths were seasoned with vinegar, which gave a sharp bite. Some believed vinegar chased away illness, others believed it cleansed the blood. No one was sure. Still, it was eaten. Garlic cloves were pounded with mortar and pestle, mixed into pastes, rubbed onto bread. Families even tied cloves around children's necks. The smell must have been impressive, but that was the point. To stink of garlic was to signal that you were fighting off death. There was also the ritual of herbal fumigation, not just juniper smoke in the north, but rosemary branches in the west, lavender when it could be found, and sage burned slowly on embers. Houses became smoky caves, thick with the scent of plants. Families breathed the air, coughed, and believed themselves cleaner for it. And, in a way, they may have been. Smoke kept insects away. The fleas that carried plague could be repelled, at least a little, by these rituals. Without knowing why, peasants stumbled onto something useful. We can pause here with folk charms, because every village had them. A pouch of dried herbs tied at the waist, a sprig of rowan over the door, a circle of chalk drawn around a child's bed. Some households kept a little bell by the window, rung at dusk to ward away spirits. Others whispered short charms before eating, murmuring words that had no meaning except within the family. A charm might be stitched into clothing, a thread of red woven through a tunic. Another might be tucked under a pillow, a carved piece of wood, a scrap of parchment with holy words. In times when even doctors were helpless, these small rituals gave comfort. And comfort, of course, was its own form of medicine. Some survival strategies were stranger still. In parts of Germany, people carried frogs in little clay pots. The belief was that the frog would draw sickness away from the body. When the frog died, which it inevitably did, the sickness was thought to have been absorbed. Was it cruel? Certainly. Was it effective? Not at all. But did it give frightened families a sense of control? Yes, it did. Elsewhere, pigeons were pressed to the skin. Feathers ruffled against boils, as though the bird might pull the poison out. And sometimes, after the pigeon inevitably died, people said the patient improved. Whether the improvement was real or just coincidence, no one could say. But in the memory of the survivors, the ritual worked, and so it was remembered. There were also the seasonal rhythms of life, which quietly shaped survival. During harvest, families stayed close to their fields, not wandering far, This naturally limited contact. In winters, households were already used to being sealed inside. Plague years simply added another layer of caution. The rhythm of farming life, with its isolation, may have helped. The very habits that made peasants seem unsophisticated, their closeness to the soil, their narrow circles of travel, may have saved them. One cannot forget animals either. Cats, dogs, chickens, goats, they lived close to humans, sometimes too close. Cats, in particular, were both cursed and blessed. In some places, they were killed for being associated with witches. In others, they were kept for their use against rats. The families that kept cats may have unknowingly given themselves an advantage, thinning the rodent populations around their homes. A child cuddling a half-wild barn cat may have been safer than a noble in a perfumed chamber. And then there was water, not clean by modern standards, but precious. Some villagers believed in drawing water only at certain times, dawn or dusk, when the wells were quiet. They thought the air was purer then. They avoided stagnant pools, though not always successfully. Vinegar was added to water, or wine diluted into it, to make it safer. Again, trial and error gave them partial wisdom. All of this, the garlic, the herbs, the frogs, the vinegar, the smoke, formed a patchwork of survival. None of it was foolproof, but each ritual, each belief, was a thread, and together the threads wove a rough net that sometimes caught life instead of letting it slip away. Meanwhile, in towns, survival required different strategies. People there lived too close, too crowded. In cities, some families learned to leave quickly, slipping away to the countryside at the first rumors. They closed shops, shuttered windows, and vanished down roads. These were the early flights that may have saved entire bloodlines. Of course, those left behind cursed them for abandoning neighbors, but those who left often lived. Others in towns became experts at dodging the watch. When quarantines were declared, some families bribed guards, snuck out at night, or smuggled food through back windows. Doctors and officials insisted on strict rules. Ordinary people bent them quietly, looking for loopholes, and often that was enough. There is a certain irony here. The doctors, with their long robes and masks, tried to impose order. They prescribed bleeding, or insisted on processions, or suggested expensive remedies. The peasants, meanwhile, simply burned rosemary and ate garlic. And yet, the survival rate among peasants was often as good or better. It is not that peasants had secret knowledge, it is that they lived closer to reality. They noticed what happened when someone went into town, or when a neighbor joined a procession, or when a doctor arrived. They drew conclusions not from books, but from watching their own lives. And so, in their quiet way, they outsmarted the plague doctors without ever trying. Let's lift our gaze upward for a moment. When the plague swept through, many people looked to the heavens. The stars, after all, were considered a map of earthly fate. Astrologers warned of ominous alignments, Jupiter and Saturn conspiring in unpleasant ways, or Mars drifting into the wrong house. Ordinary people, hearing such talk, would nod gravely. The logic was simple. If the stars could guide planting and harvest, why not sickness? But peasants were not helpless beneath the sky. Some kept tiny rituals for protection. They would not leave the house under a blood-red moon. They tied bits of iron or silver to their doors, believing these metals could ward away malign influences drifting down from the stars. They muttered short prayers if a comet appeared, and when meteors streaked across the night, they whispered their names quickly, as though announcing themselves to the sky might prevent being chosen for death. It was not astronomy, but it was a way to feel less small beneath the vastness. Folklore about witches and spirits also sharpened during plague years. A cough at night might be explained as the touch of a wandering spirit. A sudden fever could be blamed on a witch's glance. In many villages, protective charms multiplied. Ashes were sprinkled on thresholds. Horseshoes were nailed above door frames. Mothers placed knives under babies' pillows, not to harm, but to frighten away spirits. Some even believed the plague itself was a kind of ghost, drifting from house to house. To trick it, they left offerings at crossroads: bread, milk, sometimes a coin. Better to pay the ghost and keep it moving along than to let it linger. These little rituals cost almost nothing, and in times when hope was scarce, they bought peace of mind. The role of music deserves a soft note here. In towns, large gatherings of musicians sometimes made things worse, spreading illness. But in villages, small-scale music gave comfort. Families sang simple chants in the evening, voices low. Some songs were old lullabies, repurposed as prayers against sickness. Others were nonsense tunes, meant to distract children. Imagine a family huddled by firelight, a mother humming as she stirred soup, children joining in with half-remembered verses. The music was thin, but it kept silence from settling too heavily. Silence, after all, could be dangerous. It left too much room for dread. A song, even a small one, filled the space. Another quiet defense was storytelling. Grandparents told tales of earlier plagues, of years when illness came and went, and life continued. These stories were not always accurate, but they carried a lesson. People had survived before. They would survive again. Other stories leaned on folklore. Villagers spoke of saints who walked in disguise, visiting homes to test their kindness. A knock at the door might be Saint Roch, checking if a family shared its bread, or it might be Saint Sebastian, disguised as a beggar. The idea was not to frighten, but to encourage generosity, even in hard times. And though generosity might seem impractical in an age of plague, it built trust among neighbors. Trust itself was another form of survival. There were also the tiny household measures that no doctor ever recommended, but which people found comforting. Hanging laundry in direct sunlight, because the sun was thought to eat bad air. Pouring vinegar across thresholds. Placing bread out overnight to soak up disease, then burying it the next day. In some places, people covered mirrors. The belief was that mirrors could trap sickness, or reflect it back into the house. Curtains were drawn, not only for warmth, but for safety. And when someone died, the body was often left with coins on the eyes, not only to pay the ferryman of the afterlife, but to keep the gaze of death sealed shut. Perhaps the most understated survival strategy of all was simply this: quiet observation. Families noticed when a neighbor's house fell silent. They saw who had gone to market and not returned. They counted the days since a fever began and whispered about patterns. Without knowing it, they gathered data, not in books, but in memory. They passed this knowledge in short sayings. Don't go when the air is heavy. Stay home when the bells ring too often. Better garlic than gold. These were not theories. They were condensed wisdom, learned through trial, spoken in kitchens and fields. Doctors wrote in Latin, peasants wrote in sayings, and the sayings were, often, more useful. And so, if we imagine the plague years at the level of the village, we do not see grand figures in masks. We see families pulling closer, garlic drying in bundles, smoke curling from chimneys, herbs scattered on floors, cats stalking the shadows, bread left on crossroads, children singing rhymes with rosemary in their hands, frogs croaking in clay pots, juniper glowing on the hearth. It was messy, improvised, half sensible and half superstition, but it was life, and life, even in fragments, was what endured. There's a certain comfort in looking at what people chose not to do. In plague years, restraint was as important as action. Families chose not to travel far. They chose not to open the door to strangers. They chose not to spend money on expensive remedies. By doing less, by shrinking their circles, they quietly protected themselves. A family might sit in their cottage and hear the distant sound of bells from town. Those bells tolled for the dead. The family would look at each other and say little, and then they would go back to tending their goats, or mending their shoes, or stirring the pot. The world could collapse elsewhere. Here, they would keep still. Some of the simplest tricks carried hidden wisdom. Take window herbs. People set bowls of vinegar by windows, sometimes with sprigs of mint or sage floating inside. They thought the herbs would purify the air drifting in. In truth, The practice encouraged households to keep windows half-shuttered, limiting the draft of fleas. The herbs may not have mattered, the shuttering did. Or consider walking sticks. Farmers sometimes carried them not just for support, but to keep distance when speaking to others. One step farther apart, one arm's length more, a habit that cost nothing and spread nothing. Superstitions about colors also wove into survival. Red was seen as protective, tied into ribbons, stitched into clothing. Children wore scraps of red cloth at the neck or wrist. Women wove thin threads of red into hair braids. Men wore red cords around waists. The color was thought to repel evil influences. And though the logic was fanciful, the practice gave a visible marker of care. To see a child with a red ribbon was to see parents doing something, anything, to keep them safe. Animals, too, featured in survival stories in quieter ways. Dogs were sometimes set to guard thresholds, not against thieves, but against visitors who might bring infection. Chickens were encouraged to roam in yards, pecking up scraps. They cleared away vermin without anyone calling it pest control. Goats were milked steadily, their products boiled into cheese, which could last through lean weeks when markets were closed. And cats, of course, stalked in corners. Their place in folklore shifted constantly. Witch's companion one day, blessed rat hunter the next. But regardless of reputation, their presence kept rodents at bay. Some families may have owed their survival to the twitch of a cat's tail and the gleam of its eyes in the dark. We can pause for a moment on silence, because plague years were full of it. Silence when neighbors did not return. Silence when houses went dark. Silence in streets that once bustled with market chatter. For peasants, silence became another teacher. They noticed which homes stayed quiet too long. They avoided those places, even without explanation. In silence, they found direction. And in choosing where not to go, they often chose life. Another measure was seasonal timing. When rumors of plague spread, some families altered their routines. Harvests were done faster. Hay was stacked early. Some even slaughtered animals ahead of schedule, salting meat while they still could. Better to have food in storage than risk hunger later, when markets might be closed or dangerous. The salted barrels, the jars of dried peas, the bundles of herbs hanging from rafters, these became not just supplies, but shields. A family with enough to eat could afford to wait out danger. A family without might risk journeys into town, and towns were where the sickness lingered. We should also mention laughter, faint though it was. Even in plague years, people told jokes. A man with garlic hanging from his neck might be teased for smelling worse than the illness itself. A woman who burned too much sage might be told she was trying to smoke out her own family. Jokes were thin, dry, sometimes cruel, but they were jokes all the same. They gave breath to fear without naming it outright. Children laughed easily. They skipped with rosemary sprigs, singing about death as though it were a game. Ashes, ashes, as later centuries would put it. The laughter was uneasy, but it kept dread from pressing too heavily. And perhaps laughter, like garlic, was its own form of resistance. And in the end, survival was less about great discoveries than about layer upon layer of small things. Garlic, vinegar, smoke, red ribbons, iron charms, sealed doors, cats on rafters, children's songs, bowls of herbs by the window. Some worked, some didn't, but together they gave people a way to live through the uncertainty. The plague doctor, with his long beak and leather gloves, may have walked past these cottages and thought them foolish, but centuries later we can see the truth. It was not the doctor who endured, it was the families. Their small acts of caution and comfort, their quiet rituals, their stubbornness to keep going, these outsmarted the mask, the theory, the false cure. And so, as we let part one close softly, we see ordinary people not as helpless victims, but as quiet strategists. They did not fight the plague with science as we know it, but with observation, habit, and stubborn common sense. Garlic and vinegar, smoke and silence. No drama, no glory, just survival, repeated enough times to carry villagers through the darkness. So, while villagers were sealing their doors, feeding cats, and quietly surviving on garlic soup, their kings, queens, and lords were attempting strategies of their own. Strategies that, naturally, involved far more ceremony, expense, and fuss, and, just as naturally, worked far less well. Let's begin in France, because French kings never liked to be left out of anything, not even pandemics. King Philip VI of France, who reigned when the Black Death first struck in 1347, received advice from his physicians that the air itself was poisoned. Not an unusual idea for the time, but Philip's response was memorable. He ordered great bonfires lit in the streets of Paris to purify the air. The city was filled with smoke, and the smell must have been overwhelming. People coughed, choked, and stumbled through the haze. Did it stop the plague? Of course not, but it did make Paris smell like a permanent barbecue pit. Meanwhile, peasants nearby were just closing their doors, boiling herbs in pots, and waiting it out. In England, Edward III tried another approach. He issued strict proclamations: no more than so many people at funerals, no unnecessary gatherings, no markets without permission. Sensible on paper, but the nobility, naturally, ignored the rules. Banquets continued, tournaments were planned, and funerals for important lords turned into large public displays. The peasants were told to obey. The nobles carried on, and the plague carried on with them. Edward also wrote to the Lord Mayor of London, asking what could be done about the great mortality. The mayor politely informed him that little could be done except to pray, which was not, perhaps, the strong policy statement Edward had hoped for. Then there was Pope Clement VI, safely seated in Avignon when the plague arrived. His physicians advised him to sit between two enormous fires at all times, because heat would cleanse the air, and so he did. Picture it, the Pope, surrounded by roaring fires, sweltering day and night in his palace, like some roasted bird. To his credit, Clement survived, perhaps because he stayed inside, or perhaps because Avignon's plague wave receded in time. But later people remembered the image, the Pope sweating between bonfires while peasants outside hung garlic on their doors. The royals also leaned heavily on astrology. Kings employed astrologers to chart the heavens and explain why so many subjects were dying. The verdicts were usually along the lines of, well, Saturn is in an unfortunate house. Not exactly actionable advice, but kings nodded gravely, commissioned more charts, and carried on. Meanwhile, peasants noticed that if a neighbor visited town and came back coughing, the whole household fell ill. A rather more direct form of science, though it came without the Latin. Another royal tactic was flight. Kings and nobles fled cities as soon as plague appeared, retreating to country estates. This was not always a bad idea, but it often backfired. Whole entourages traveled together: servants, guards, cooks, musicians, sometimes even falcons and hunting dogs. It was less a retreat and more a moving village. If even one member carried plague, the infection spread merrily through the group. Peasants, in contrast, fled in twos and threes, or simply stayed put. Smaller numbers, fewer risks. A noble household on the move was like a parade announcing illness at every stop. Let's not forget the royal cures. These were lavish, expensive concoctions, filled with exotic ingredients: pearls ground into powder, gold leaf, sapphires, precious spices from the East. The theory was that the more expensive a remedy, the more effective it must be. Kings swallowed these potions, grimacing at the taste, only to fall ill anyway. Meanwhile, peasants chewed garlic and burned rosemary. One solution emptied treasuries. The other grew in the garden. By the 15th century, some monarchs had grown almost comical in their attempts. Charles VI of France, already prone to delusions, became convinced that touching certain holy relics would keep him safe. He collected them obsessively, surrounding himself with pieces of bone, bits of cloth, and other sacred odds and ends. He carried on this way until he suffered one of his famous breakdowns. at which point the relics were forgotten until the next crisis. And, naturally, plague continued to arrive on schedule, regardless of Charles's collection. The irony is hard to miss. The peasants, poor and overlooked, used small, practical measures. Stay home, burn herbs, avoid strangers, feed the cat. The royals, rich and advised by learned men, built bonfires in the streets, swallowed powdered sapphires, and roasted themselves between pyres. And in the end, survival rates were not so different. It's a humbling reminder that in those years, knowledge was not evenly distributed. Not because peasants had more facts, but because they had more caution. And sometimes caution, garlic-scented though it may be, outsmarted both doctors and kings. If we drift southward into Spain, the royal court was little different. Kings and queens there relied heavily on processions. Priests marched with relics, nobles carried candles, and the whole court walked through the streets to pray away the plague. It looked impressive. It also gathered thousands of people close together, which, naturally, spread infection. The peasants noticed. They began praying in their kitchens instead, muttering quiet words over steaming bowls of stew. The difference in outcomes was predictable. In the German principalities, the smaller courts produced stranger spectacles. Princes often insisted that the plague was a punishment for sin, which, to be fair, was a fairly standard theory at the time. The solution was mass repentance. Nobles dressed in sackcloth for a week or two, fasting while still sipping fine wines and listening to minstrels. Once they had displayed their piety, they returned to feasts. The plague, however, was not impressed. It lingered anyway. Peasants, meanwhile, performed their own rituals, but with practical twists. A sprinkling of ashes at the door, a cord of garlic at the window, a bell rung at dusk. Less spectacle, more persistence. The Byzantine court, in Constantinople, was no less dramatic. Emperors there ordered elaborate purifications of the city. Streets were washed with vinegar. Public fountains were drained and refilled with water blessed by priests. Churches burned incense constantly. It must have smelled like one enormous perfume shop. And yet, in the alleys, the plague carried on. Ordinary families in the city did what they could. They avoided markets, closed shutters, and kept to their courtyards. The imperial efforts may have been impressive on parchment, but in practice, they mattered less than a mother's decision to keep her children indoors for an extra week. Back in France, the Valois dynasty produced a memorable mix of superstition and bad timing. Court physicians recommended that nobles avoid bathing, because water was thought to open the pores to disease, so royal households went unwashed for months. Imagine the perfume bills. Layers upon layers of rose oil, musk, and ambergris, all meant to cover the fact that no one had bathed since Easter. Peasants, ironically, sometimes fared better. They bathed in rivers when they could, or at least washed faces and hands with buckets of water, not perfectly hygienic, but more cleansing than a court drowning itself in perfume. In Italy, city-states like Florence and Venice saw their elites experiment with quarantines. Venetian officials were among the first to formalize the practice. Ships arriving at port had to wait 40 days before passengers were allowed ashore. Nobles praised the policy, but often exempted themselves. Venetian merchants would bribe their way past restrictions. Nobles, unwilling to wait, left quarantine ships early. Ordinary sailors and peasants had no such privilege, and ironically, were sometimes safer for it. The Holy Roman emperors, sprawling across Central Europe, tried grand declarations, edicts against gathering, edicts against gambling, edicts against immoral dancing, which they felt surely invited plague. One emperor even issued a warning against wearing bright colors, as though red stockings might tempt disease. None of this worked, of course, but it did produce endless parchments and proclamations, giving the illusion of action. The peasants, again, ignored much of this. They kept to their garlic and vinegar, and, as always, tried to outlast the nobility's decrees. Royal remedies sometimes tipped into the absurd. Consider the fad for jewels as medicine. Physicians recommended wearing sapphires against the skin, or grinding emeralds into powder and swallowing them. Pearls dissolved in vinegar were thought to cleanse the stomach. Kings and queens paid fortunes for these glittering cures. The results were predictable: lighter treasuries, heavier stomachs, and no real protection. Meanwhile, peasants hung sprigs of rosemary in doorways. One cost a king's ransom, the other grew wild by the roadside. We can also pause on royal denial, a survival strategy in its own right. Many rulers simply refused to acknowledge plague until it was unavoidable. Courts would go on with banquets and hunts, pretending all was well, until half the servants were gone. Only then would they panic too late, usually, to change much. By contrast, peasants learned to act quickly. A rumor of plague was enough for a village to close its gates, or for a family to avoid the next market day. Small moves, made early, mattered more than royal edicts delivered too late. Even when royals did survive, it was often due less to wisdom than to sheer luck and insulation. High walls, private estates, better food, all of these created distance from disease. Yet even here, they found ways to complicate matters. A court filled with physicians, astrologers, relics, and jewel potions often fared no better than a cottage where someone simply boiled garlic soup and kept the door shut. It's a strange contrast, isn't it? On one hand, the most powerful people in Europe, with armies, wealth, and knowledge at their disposal. On the other, nameless villagers living with dirt floors and smoky rafters. And yet, when the plague came, both faced the same odds. In many cases, the villager with garlic fared better than the king with sapphires. In Hungary, the royal court leaned heavily on processions of relics. The bones of saints were carried through towns, held aloft under embroidered canopies. It was thought that relics, being fragments of holiness, could repel disease. The trouble, of course, was that entire crowds gathered to see them. 1,000 villagers pressed shoulder to glimpse a splinter of wood, said to be from the true cross. The relic glowed. The priests sang, and meanwhile the plague strolled quietly through the crowd, quite unhindered. Peasants responded in their own way. They might still light a candle before a saint's image, but they tended to do it at home. One candle, one corner table, no crowds. The ritual was smaller, humbler, and far less dangerous. Polish nobles leaned toward astrology. Stars were consulted, charts were drawn, and entire calendars were prepared, dictating when it was safe to travel or dine. One noble family even refused to open their windows for 6 months, because Mars was in the wrong house. The air inside must have been dreadful. Villagers, meanwhile, simply opened windows whenever it smelled too musty indoors. A far less cosmic, far more practical solution. Scandinavia presented its own curious blend of Christian ritual and lingering folk belief. Swedish and Danish royals prayed in great stone churches, while peasants in the countryside whispered charms to the old spirits of forest and field. Some left offerings of bread at crossroads, asking unseen guardians for protection. The church disapproved, but in private, many did both, crossing themselves at the altar and then scattering crumbs at the edge of a meadow. Ironically, this layering of beliefs created a kind of psychological safety net. If one prayer failed, perhaps another charm might succeed. And in times of fear, even a faint sense of hope was valuable. England, never short on eccentricity, produced some especially vivid remedies among its elites. Court physicians recommended that nobles carry pouches of dried toads as amulets. Others suggested powdered unicorn horn, which, in reality, was powdered narwhal tusk, traded from the Arctic at astronomical prices. Kings and dukes paid fortunes for what was essentially ground ivory. Meanwhile, peasants clutched sprigs of lavender, worn in aprons or tucked into hats. Both were meant to ward off evil airs. One emptied a treasury, the other grew freely in hedgerows. The outcome was the same. Russia took a slightly different approach, leaning heavily on Orthodox ritual. Processions carried icons of the Virgin Mary through snow and mud, while choirs sang until their voices cracked. The Tsars retreated behind thick walls of the Kremlin, praying with monks. Peasants, as always, adjusted in more modest ways. They avoided markets, smoked out their cottages with birch branches, and stored onions in every corner. The effect was similar across the board. The plague cared little for crowns or candles, little for incense or onion smoke. But the small local habits, keeping distance, tending fires, eating simply, often worked better than grand rituals. By the 16th century, royals across Europe had begun investing in country estates as plague retreats. Palaces in cities became dangerous, so rulers built lodges in forests, manors on hills, villas along rivers. The idea was simple: isolate, surround oneself with trusted servants, and wait. The irony was that peasants had already been doing this for centuries. They stayed in their hamlets, avoided strangers, and lived close to their fields. The difference was scale. Where kings fled to a marble hunting lodge, a farmer simply stayed in his thatched cottage. Both strategies worked about the same, which must have been quietly disappointing to anyone who had just spent a fortune on a new palace. Perhaps the most enduring irony of all was this: royal households often spread the plague more effectively than they avoided it. A king never truly traveled alone. He moved with courtiers, servants, cooks, guards, jesters, scribes, and doctors, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people in his wake. If one of them carried disease, the entire court soon followed. A peasant, however, could live with his family of 6, on a farm with no visitors, and quietly survive. Crowds were danger, simplicity was safety. And so, while the chronicles remembered the kings and queens who fled to estates, who ordered processions, who swallowed ground emeralds or clutched narwhal tusks, the quieter truth is this: survival belonged to those who lived humbly, those who boiled garlic, shut doors, and waited. The plague did not discriminate, but the habits of survival, simple, local, stubborn, often came more naturally to the nameless than to the crowned. In the Ottoman Empire, sultans were advised by their court physicians to avoid stagnant air, which, in Istanbul, was nearly everywhere. Palaces were fumigated daily with incense, rosewater was splashed along the walls, and windows were draped with heavy silks soaked in herbal mixtures. It must have smelled like a perpetual perfume festival. The sultans retreated into interior chambers, surrounded by cushions, fountains, and attendants carrying censers of smoke. And yet, plague crept in regardless. A single servant might bring it from the marketplace, a soldier from the barracks, a merchant from the docks. No amount of rosewater on marble could keep it entirely away. In quieter neighborhoods, peasants did simpler things: shutting doors, burning vinegar in clay pots, or keeping chickens close at hand, believing the birds absorbed bad air. The results were often no worse than in the palaces of Topkapi. The Mughal court in India responded in its own theatrical style. Emperors, surrounded by astrologers and poets, listened to elaborate calculations of the stars. If the heavens aligned poorly, the emperor might delay audiences or relocate the court entirely. The court itself was a small city, thousands of people in tents and palaces, with food vendors, musicians, soldiers, and scribes. In theory, relocation would avoid plague. In practice, it simply carried it along. Meanwhile, villages in rural India followed their own customs. Smoke from dung fires was thought to purify the air. Wells were covered with cloth to keep out unseen spirits. Women spread neem leaves in corners of huts, their sharp smell believed to guard against disease. Compared to the emperor's astrologers, these were homely rituals, but neem leaves had mild antibacterial qualities, and smoke did keep insects at bay. Again, quiet practicality fared better than golden predictions. In China, imperial officials responded with great bureaucracy. Local magistrates filed endless reports on outbreaks, stamped with red seals and countersigned in triplicate. Mandarins debated whether plague was punishment for corruption, or the result of neglecting proper rituals. In the Forbidden City, emperors relied on physicians who mixed complicated brews of herbs. Many quite bitter ministers drank them obediently, whether or not they helped. Outside the palace walls, farmers relied on garlic, ginger, and green onions. Kitchens smelled sharp and pungent, but the food was warming, and the herbs carried mild antiseptic properties. It was not perfect protection, but it gave families something to hold on to. When imperial decrees and bitter teas offered only paperwork, even in North Africa, rulers leaned on ritual. In Morocco, sultans ordered public prayers in great squares. People gathered shoulder to shoulder under the sun, calling on God to lift the pestilence. A noble act of faith, but once again, a crowded act of faith. Villagers in the mountains prayed too, but in smaller gatherings, on lonely hillsides, with fewer people pressed together. The contrast was almost mathematical. The plague cared very little for eloquence, it cared for distance. Across cultures then, the same quiet pattern repeats. Rulers displayed grandeur, wealth, and ritual. Palaces burned incense, courts swallowed jewels, emperors relocated with their entire retinues. Meanwhile, villagers made garlic soup, burned vinegar, covered wells, and muttered charms into the smoke. Neither group was guaranteed survival, but one group complicated matters endlessly, while the other worked with what little they had. It's almost comforting, in a way. The simplest human instincts, keep clean, keep distance, eat what warms you, avoid crowds, were often the most effective. And those instincts, of course, belonged more to the ploughman and the shepherd than to the crowned head. A sultan could command 1,000 censers of incense. A peasant could light one twig of juniper. In the end, both coughed just the same, but sometimes the peasant's twig of smoke lingered longer than all the perfume of the palace. Let's drift westward, across the ocean. The Aztec Empire faced waves of epidemic disease after the arrival of Europeans. Not quite the bubonic plague, but to them, it might as well have been. The priests of Tenochtitlan burned copal incense until the air shimmered. Offerings of maize, cacao, and flowers were placed at temple steps. The sick were sometimes left in their own quarters, tended only by family. The nobility, of course, retreated to palaces, surrounded by attendants carrying bundles of herbs. But the sickness spread through water and air, not temples or incense. Rituals filled the plazas, but the illness continued. Villagers in the countryside, far from the capital, often fared better, simply by distance. Their remedies were simple: steam baths in sweat lodges, herbal poultices, isolation in small huts. They lacked the grandeur of processions, but the results were no worse. The Inca, high in the Andes, had their own customs. When sickness struck, nobles consulted diviners, who threw maize kernels or read the flight of birds. Priests made sacrifices, llamas, sometimes more costly offerings, hoping to appease mountain spirits. Rulers withdrew to remote estates in the Sacred Valley, surrounded by terraces of maize and guarded by loyal warriors. In villages, the sick were sometimes placed in small houses at the edge of settlements, cared for from a distance. Families burned fires at night to ward off spirits. Some communities avoided travel between valleys altogether, relying only on their own terraces for food. In a way, the mountains themselves acted as a natural quarantine, harder to cross than any wall a king could build. In Japan, during outbreaks, shoguns and emperors relied heavily on ritual purity. Shrines were washed, and elaborate exorcisms were performed. Priests recited prayers, sometimes for hours, while nobles wore layers of white silk, believed to repel impurity. The common people did what they always did, bathed often in rivers and hot springs, partly for hygiene, partly for comfort. Ironically, their emphasis on cleanliness helped. A bucket of hot water did more for health than silk robes. In the courts of early modern Europe, the same patterns repeated. Take Elizabeth I of England. During outbreaks of plague in London, she retreated from the city entirely. Whole plays were banned, markets closed, and people driven out of crowded streets. Elizabeth held audiences only in country palaces, surrounded by courtiers who had been carefully screened. Yet plague still slipped through on the breath of a servant, or the touch of a groom holding the reins of a horse. or Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself. Versailles, with its gilded halls and endless corridors, became his retreat from plague-ridden Paris. It was enormous, radiant, overflowing with courtiers, which, naturally, meant that if disease reached Versailles, it reached 1,000 people at once. The king burned incense, surrounded himself with perfumed courtiers, and avoided open air. Meanwhile, peasants in the French countryside continued to wash their laundry in streams, hang garlic from rafters, and stay alive in their modest cottages. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, when medicine had advanced somewhat, the habits of the powerful remained stubbornly ceremonial. During cholera outbreaks, nobles across Europe ordered carriages fumigated with vinegar. Hospitals were avoided at all costs, because they smelled of death. Wealthy families carried pomanders filled with spices. Peasants continued with their garlic, their smoky kitchens, their prayers muttered at dusk. The tools had changed little. The illusions of control remained the same. If there is one thread that binds all these courts together, Aztec, Inca, Ottoman, Mughal, Chinese, Japanese, English, French, it is the strange persistence of ritual over reason, the belief that a glittering jewel, a sacred procession, or a robe of silk could protect against something unseen, and alongside that, the persistence of ordinary survival, herbs in doorways, smoke in rafters, distance from crowds. One is remembered in chronicles, the other in silence, yet silence often survived longer. By the Napoleonic era, science had begun to nibble at the edges of disease theory. Germs were not yet fully understood, but doctors spoke more often of contagion rather than just bad air. Napoleon himself, always eager to present an image of control, famously visited plague victims in Jaffa during his Egyptian campaign. He touched the sick, or at least allowed himself to be painted doing so, in a gesture of fearless command. In reality, the army was riddled with disease, and the emperor retreated soon after. His soldiers whispered that he had braved the plague. His doctors whispered that it was mostly for show. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers had their own tactics, burning their clothes, airing bedding in sunlight, and rationing garlic or onions when they could find them. Hardly glamorous, but often more effective than imperial pageantry. By the Victorian age, cholera had become the great scourge of cities. In London, the rich fled to country estates at the first rumor of outbreak. Carriages rolled out of town, leaving behind the crowded poor in stinking tenements. Royal households ordered servants to boil water, though only after many outbreaks proved that water, not air, carried the disease. The irony is sharp. While Queen Victoria was advised to drink carefully boiled beverages, working-class families who could not afford fine wines were already drinking beer and ale, liquids that had been boiled in brewing and were by accident safer. Once again, practicality outpaced privilege. Even in the late 19th century, perfume still clung to the aristocracy as a supposed defense. French nobles dabbed scented oils on handkerchiefs, holding them delicately to their noses while passing through city streets. Doctors, meanwhile, finally began insisting on soap and clean water. Peasants who bathed in rivers, as they had for centuries, suddenly seemed ahead of the curve. During the Spanish flu of 1918, monarchs faced the same invisible enemy as everyone else. Kings of Europe donned masks reluctantly, often late, more concerned with appearances than with health. Royal households shrank their courts, dismissing servants for safety. But servants, of course, were the ones most exposed, living in close quarters and commuting through crowded streets. The influenza showed little interest in crowns. It passed from maid to butler to lord with effortless equality. Villagers, once again, relied on distance. Families stayed put, avoided markets, closed doors, and waited. The same habits that had served them in plague years served them again, hundreds of years later. And so the long arc bends back on itself. From medieval kings clutching emeralds, to sultans surrounded by incense, to Victorians clutching perfumed handkerchiefs, to modern monarchs reluctantly wearing cloth masks. The story is one of ceremony over simplicity. The peasants with garlic, the villagers with smoke, the families who simply stayed home. They lacked glory, but they often lasted. The royals had spectacle, jewels, and incense, but spectacle does not breathe, and jewels do not heal. Through all the centuries, all the palaces, all the courts, the story has been the same. The grand halls filled with jewels and perfumes, the servants marching with relics, the physicians balancing humors and prescribing pearls. And meanwhile, in the cottages, the garlic smoke, the prayers whispered over soup, the stubborn closing of doors. The chronicles remembered the kings, the villagers remembered themselves. One made noise, the other endured. The plague did not care who wore a crown or who slept on straw, but persistence mattered. The small choices, the sprig of rosemary, the boiled bucket of water, the decision to avoid the market that week, mattered more than rubies, emeralds, or star charts. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson, floating across time. Survival is rarely glorious, it is rarely written down, but it can be stubborn, humble, and steady.